Good morning. How are you?
Good morning, everyone. Mike Ongstead here with New American Movement, joined this time for a Friday Flannel panel by Mary Anna Mancuso, not the usual Joel Searby, who is not able to join us today. But hey, we wanted to come in, we wanted to talk about some of the big news that's been facing the country and the world this week. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Mary Anna, how are you doing this Friday morning?
I am so fantastic. I can't tell you how excited I'm here to be here in Flannel Friday. Long-time listener, long-time fan, first-time arrival on this. So welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm on my third cup of coffee, and you still have 10 times the amount of energy I do. So glad to have you to spruce up and spice up the broadcast for me. We'll start off with the most obvious news, the thing that's been happening now for almost 2 weeks, and that is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've been getting, in some ways, this is one of the most broadcast wars that the world has ever seen, because everyone has in their pocket a camera and a platform that they can broadcast to. So we've seen horrific images. We've seen, destroyed civilian buildings. We've seen, also scenes of heroism from the Ukrainian people. Just what's your, quick take on just what we've seen so far?
Well, I think it's safe to say that Vladimir Putin had thoroughly underestimated the Ukrainian people and President Zelensky, and I'm okay with that. It continues to be a humanitarian crisis, and now with the shell casing fire that happened at the nuclear power plant over the evening, we know that we're literally standing on possibly the precipice of a potential nuclear disaster, which would be 10 times greater than Chernobyl. And I just think all of this is so tragic, and my heart continues to go out to the Ukrainian people, and I really pray that there's a solution sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it's been horrific. One thing that keeps popping into my head is as I watch the same videos that everyone's seeing and kind of try to follow on Twitter and social media as much as possible is kind of how there's almost I think some people are feeling a kind of like they're watching a movie or playing a game, right? And unfortunately, I think the thing we need to remember to keep into perspective is that there's real world hurt going on, lives being lost and others just being devastated. And this situation, even though the Russian attack has not been apparently as successful as perhaps they imagined it would be, this is going to get much worse. And I think that's a reality we need to steel ourselves to. I still hold out hope that some sort of peaceful resolution can be found that respects Ukrainian sovereignty and territory. But the reality is that the more powerful military is still the Russian military, and we should acknowledge that this is by no means, the successes we've seen from the Ukrainians are heroic and incredible, but by no means are they about to win this war.
Yeah, it's heart-wrenching to watch from the United States and recognize that there's very little that we can do. Now, there was a call for people to pick up arms and come into Ukraine and help fight. So that obviously is an option. But I was watching an interview this morning.
It's not a good one. I cannot stress enough, do not fly to Ukraine and try and join the Ukrainian military.
This is probably not the time for that. But there was an interview with a famous singer in Ukraine, and he was just pleading on air this morning for America to help and, to send more ammunition, to just help. And I have to be honest, as listening to that, I felt really helpless because, there's not much I can do. We're beholden to what our government chooses to do and how NATO chooses to respond in the United Nations. And it's really just sad to watch these people have to flee their country and not probably be able to go back.
It is sad. It is sad. I think I've seen already over more than 1 million Ukrainians have fled the country. More, I imagine, are on their way or trying to on a daily basis, especially as troops get closer to Kyiv. It's unfortunately, this is not the first humanitarian disaster we've seen Putin inflict or help inflict. For years and years, he's been helping the brutal Assad regime inflict similar types of terror and death on the Syrian people. He finally felt I guess, free enough to try and do it himself rather than through a proxy government on the people of Ukraine, which leads me to some kind of a big talking point that I want to talk about. It's been one of the most maddening things that I've seen, and that is, first of all, this isn't an American political battle, right? This isn't an opportunity to try and score points, and yet we see constantly from the right, especially early on, people both praising Vladimir Putin, including the former president, but then also trying to use this incursion to say that Joe Biden is weak, that this is only happening because Joe Biden is weak and because, wouldn't happen if Donald Trump were president.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I've seen comments like that. I was tweeting during the State of the Union, as were you, as was Renew America and many of our other colleagues. And somebody commented, this wouldn't be an issue if Trump was still in power. And I didn't even respond because I didn't think it was necessary to jump down in that foxhole and be bludgeoned to death with their experience of just pure idiocy. However, it does raise a really interesting point because we are seeing the far right news talking about this. I mean, you can talk about Tucker Carlson last night. I mean, I just can't even believe that. First of all, that man is still on television. But
well, I'm going to say something controversial here, and that is that people on the right are correct that Putin would not be invading Ukraine if Trump were still president. The problem is they don't understand why Putin would not be invading Ukraine if Trump were still president. And the reason is because when Trump was president, Putin was getting everything that he already wanted. He was getting the largest, most powerful country in NATO to destabilize NATO, to threaten to leave, to create disunity, and to cast doubt on whether or not NATO would be an effective alliance in the region. And also at the same time, further damaging the prospects of Ukraine ever becoming a NATO nation. So, in some ways, this is happening because Donald Trump is no longer president, but it's happening because Trump's, constant, Putin's our friend. Why shouldn't we be friends with Russia? Or NATO's, why should we be so tied to NATO? Maybe I'll leave NATO. All of that stuff was exactly what Putin wanted. Enter Joe Biden, and Joe Biden actually speaks quite eloquently and passionately about the defense of democracy as this general principle and about the alliances of the Western world, NATO specifically, as part of his big campaign. I still remember I think his first real speech as a candidate was this big speech about the importance of democracy, not just in America, but as this global goal, the alliance and brotherhood of democracies. So, Joe Biden comes in and he's actually reunifying NATO and reassuring allies that NATO will be powerful, that the United States would, in fact, invoke Article 5 protections of NATO countries. And Putin, after 4 years of getting everything he wanted, suddenly was getting the exact opposite. And I think, only one man knows why he decided to do it, and that's Vladimir Putin. But I think ultimately his decision was based on feeling like, crap, I need to move now while there's still some perceived weakness in NATO and try and capture that before they actually get their shit together. With every conflict, there's 1,000 other reasons that these things happen. So it's foolish to try and boil it down to one thing. But certainly, I think that was a major dynamic on play here, is that the Western democracies, the pro-freedom the Liberty Club, as imperfect as many of the members of that club are, we're starting to coalesce and reunite. And Putin decided he had a chance to strike quickly. And the best thing I can say is that his decision has drawn NATO closer. It has brought Scandinavian nations who are not NATO members, like Finland, closer into the fold and potentially to become part of that alliance. And it's really backfired in every single way. And so to all the people who've said, Putin's strong, Trump is weak, or Biden is weak, and that's why all of this is happening. I had some Republican friends who would tell me in the first 2 or 3 days of this conflict, oh, Trump's beating. All right, clear my head. Putin's beating Biden like a drum. And my response to that was like, how? Putin's not getting anything that he wants just yet. He's unifying the NATO alliance against him. He's exposed himself as a complete danger to the world order, and he is inviting sanctions. And ultimately, what we're seeing now is Putin's not a strategic genius. Too many Republicans have been buying that line. They've been looking at photos of Putin riding horses shirtless in the mountains and thinking like, well, that guy looks strong. And the reality is, I'm not going to say he's incompetent, but he's corrupt, and corruption has basically made him impotent as military power. And it has kept his economy from ever becoming something worthwhile. And, as a result, we're seeing that Biden played this incredibly well, in fact, and exposed everything that Putin was going to do before he did it. He now has no justification, nothing to hide behind, and many of his forces seem to be stuck without logistical supplies and not performing well. And he looks even weaker now as a result, which is also why I think he's more dangerous, because the weaker he looks on the international stage, the more he's going to want to act out and prove he's powerful. And in his mind, that's probably going to mean more indiscriminate bombing, more murder.
Definitely. And I think it's important to point out that, because obviously we see the tanks rolling into Ukraine, we see them trying to take control of various parts of the country. But it's important to really note that Putin did not have the support of his military advisors on this. They told him, do not do this. What are you doing? And he's kind of a man on an island by himself as he tries to navigate through treating Ukraine like just a chess piece on the board and thinking that he can take it and then dominate the rest of Europe, because that's obviously where he's going. He will not stop at Ukraine. And it is so important that Ukraine stands strong and pushes back on Russian forces from taking over their country and instilling a new government.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to presuppose too much from what his military people said. They probably said, whatever you want, just keep giving us billions of dollars as oligarchs. But I do think you see among military ranks certainly a lack of morale, and certainly a lack of preparation and a lack of coordination. So we'll see. I do want to jump back and use this kind of an awkward transition point. But, as I said, one of the things that I really liked about Joe Biden as a candidate was he spoke very eloquently about restoring this order of democracies around the world. And then earlier this week, we had the State of the Union address. And of course, the first, I think, 11 or 12 minutes of his speech were dedicated to Ukraine, which is fitting. One thing, kind of my immediate reaction to that speech, though, was there was a lot of very heavy, specific Putin-Ukraine talk, but he really missed the opportunity to make that case to the American people for why we should care about Ukraine, why we should care about a free democracy, a flawed democracy, granted, but a free democracy in Russia's orbit, their neighbor. Why should we care about them? Why should we as America return to that kind of supporting democracy around the world? And he didn't get into that as much as I had hoped. And so it's a topic that he's touched on quite a bit before.
Yeah, I was surprised too. I thought that he would kind of lean into that. I mean, there's really a moment here where we can unite the country as well as the rest of the world in support for Ukraine. And I hope that this happens, and I hope it happens before the potential outbreak of World War III, to be quite frank. I think that, the American people are looking to be united under something, and we couldn't unite under the pandemic for obvious reasons, but now's an opportunity. And I hope that at some point we do see a speech from President Biden talking about the need for democracy around the world and not just here in America.
Yeah, I found, we put out a statement, Renew America, and a line in it that I'm partial to that said something like, from the steps of our capital to the streets of Kyiv, the cause of liberty is tied. And I think it's an important point, right? Like, none of these things are happening in a microcosm. The attack on our capital and the attempted overthrow of a democracy by a dictator, both of those are tied. They're part of one larger, broader movement that is, at its most charitable, a loss of confidence in democracy as a form of government, but in reality is more like a march of authoritarianism against democracy and against individual liberty. And it's happening, in very obvious terms in Ukraine, but it happened in more subtler terms on the steps of the Capitol, where people tried to overthrow an election, but did so under the guise of, oh, we think the election was wrong. We're just trying to really, defend the election as we think it probably should have had gone. And so you've got kind of two very contrasting images. And what I want to see from, not just from Biden, but is something that I think the Renew America movement works very heavily towards, and something that we expect to see and do see from a lot of our renewers that we're supporting, is people who are making that larger philosophical argument of democracy is the best form of government. Democracy is the way in which our individual liberty and individual power is best preserved, even when we lose an election, or an election goes in a way that we otherwise would have preferred it not. But one of those key values of a renewer, and everyone associated with the Renew America movement, is that fundamental belief that it's important that we defend democracy in the United States and around the world.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important that as we get closer to the midterm elections, we are supporting, we have a list on our website at renewamerica.com, or renewamericamovement.com, where you can actually check out the renewers and the candidates that we're supporting, as well as some watch listers that we're watching their races across the country. But it's so important for us to be electing principled, unifying leaders to office and making sure that we're ousting the dividers. You can also see our dividers on the site. You probably won't be surprised when you see Lauren Boebert, Madison Cawthorn, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, among others. But it's so important that we actually put people in office who are going to protect the sanctity of our elections, encourage healthy democracy, to your point, Mike, and also just overall people that will deal in the same set of facts that everybody else is, and not alternative conspiracy theorists.
Yeah. I want to jump in and mention real quick a comment from Jeff Brooks, who's watching. He says, in the age of increasingly autocratic powers, might NATO be transformed, expanded into a worldwide alliance of democracies? Wanted to address this real quick. I'm a foreign policy guy. One kind of concern about NATO and expanding NATO even more, that is a legitimate concern for the alliance, is the harder it becomes to invoke that Article 5 common protection clause, which is what, of course, NATO invoked after the 9/11 attacks, that an attack on one is an attack on all. But the larger it becomes, the harder it is. Moldova gets attacked. Are we really going to mobilize towards that? India is a democracy. It gets attacked. Is NATO going to mobilize for that? So NATO, I don't think, is necessarily the right avenue for that kind of thing. But I do think that President Biden has a chance to lead. And he held a summit of democracies late last year, I believe. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a space for us to create to solidify the brotherhood of democracies, as I will call it, in something that is less military but more diplomatic. Ideally, the United Nations has some, being itself a quasi-democratic institution, would fill that role, but it's just not, right? Because Russia and China have a veto vote on everything through the Security Council, right? So I think there is room for that kind of alliance of democracies that can be a more broadly united effort. I would love to see it. I don't think NATO is the place for that because of its military alliance standpoint. But I would love to see President Biden lead more strongly and lean further into that global alliance on democracies. But one of the major problems is of course, how much is America currently, the American people, united? How much of a priority is that for us as a nation right now? And I think you see some alarming polling sometimes about how many people are losing confidence in democracy here in America. And some of those people, those dividers, like a Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene, they're trying to make us lose confidence in democracy even more. Donald Trump wants us to believe that the entire 2020 election was rigged and stolen and fake and whatever, because he wants us to lose confidence in democracy so that he doesn't have to deal with actually winning votes anymore. He can just become president, be powerful, do what he wants. And there are a lot of people who want that. So, I would love to see us lead on the global stage, but if we're going to lead on the global stage, we have to start leading the pro-democracy renewal right here in America. And that's a huge part of what we're trying to do at Renew America, right? To shore up democracy here, to shore up our faith, confidence, and love of democracy in America, so that then we can be that shining city on a hill. We can lead that global movement Now, you can't just neglect that global movement until our house is in order, but we need to get our house in order to better lead that global movement.
We should be a beacon of hope for the rest of the world, 100%.
Would be nice. Okay, so we've touched on obviously Ukraine. We've touched on the State of the Union. What are the other big news things going on?
Oh gosh, I mean, so many things, right? We have not talked about Marjorie Taylor Greene is hosting a Stop the Socialism rally in Georgia actually today. So that should be interesting. And Herschel Walker is also headlining that event. And so it's interesting to see them go around. We have radical candidates that we're identifying at Renew America Foundation that are actually just causing problems and will continue to undermine democracy, peddle conspiracy theories, and support QAnon. And so I think it's important to pay attention to those and make sure that we're voting in our local elections. Obviously, at Renew America, we talk about candidates that are running for House and candidates that are running for Senate, but also looking at your local races. And you know best in your backyard who the candidates are. And we are working hard to shine a light on them. But sometimes we miss them. So reach out and tell us who you think we should pay attention to.
Yeah. You find a divider. Feel free to drop us an email. Let us know who they are. Shoot us a tweet. Odds are we're already tracking them, but it's hard to track all of them because there's just so many radicals out there. But I will say, one important thing to touch on, CPAC, the convention, the Conservative Political Action Committee convention, whatever, was held recently at the exact same time. America First PAC was hosted by one white nationalist incel, Nick Fuentes. He, of course, I should say neo-Nazi, really, because he at the actual speech, made some reference to calling Putin a Nazi, like that's a bad thing. Like, yeah, it is, bro. But of course, who appears at that other than Marjorie Taylor Greene, of course. And you just constantly see people like MTG and then her cadre of supporters, Matt Gaetz, Lauren Boebert, all the dividers left and right. Accidentally finding themselves at these racist neo-Nazi white nationalist conventions and speaking up on their defense. And every time it's just such a shameful pattern. Every time they then, the Kevin McCarthy comes out and goes, oh no, there's no room for that in the Republican Party. And then 2 days later, Marjorie Taylor Greene has floor seats to the State of the Union, which are not guaranteed to get because, Senate and House both attend generally. Now, a lot of people, I think, didn't attend, for COVID reasons and some for political stunt reasons. But Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene end up with floor seats to the State of the Union so that they can then shout and heckle Joe Biden while he talks about his deceased son. It's just the Republican leadership. They just constantly excuse these radicals, these people who are fully embracing white nationalist and neo-Nazi type folks, and then they'll come back and they'll tisk them, but then the next day they're back, and the question I haven't seen Kevin McCarthy answer yet is he vowed to put Marjorie Taylor Greene back on her committees because she was stripped of her committees for the last time she was all white nationalist, anti-Semitic. And he vowed to put her back on committees. Well, is he still going to put her back on committees after she went to this America First white nationalist neo-Nazi convention?
Probably. There's no more shame in the Republican Party. There's no more shame in it. People aren't being shamed. They're not being called out. They're not being told you cannot serve under this party banner anymore. It's complicit. As a matter of fact, I would say the first, and it's been a while since we've seen like a resignation from somebody. And we just saw one happen in Texas by a gentleman that had an affair with the former ISIS bride. And, but other than that, recently, I can't think of a person who has been shamed out of their seat.
Yeah, well, that's a good transition because Jim Fee is asking us some questions, thoughts on Abbott defending his challenge in the recent primary, and Paul Gosar. Was it Paul Gosar, or are you thinking Louis Gohmert, Jim? I'm not sure, but either way, Texas had their primary elections. It was an interesting. I am formerly a Texan, now a Virginian, but so I followed it with great interest, and it struck me that these primary elections went basically as well as could be hoped, but were still dreadful, right? So Greg Abbott won his primary and will be the Republican candidate for governor again. And a lot of people hate Greg Abbott, and I think he's done a lot to earn scorn and hate. But the people he was up against, Alan West, is even worse. Don, I think it was Huffines or Huffiness, I'm not sure, is even crazier, more radical. So, it's like, of the people that had a legitimate chance of becoming Republican gubernatorial candidate, Jim Abbott is actually the most sane. And that's a terrifying prospect for Texas. And then the Louis Gohmert race, I think I tweeted this. One of the best things about dividers is sometimes they're so craven and so deluded that they eliminate themselves from politics. And Louis Gohmert did that. He decided not to run for his congressional seat again because he wanted to be the secretary, or oh gosh, what did he run for? Basically, he wanted to be in charge of Texas's elections. It's not Secretary of State. It's basically Attorney General. It's Attorney General. That's what it is. Now, the current Texas AG is a guy named Ken Paxton. Ken Paxton is an actual criminal. Like he I don't say that in hyperbole. He's a crook who is under investigation for some sort of financial irregularities. I forget the specifics of it. Basically inside dealing. But then he's also under investigation for firing people who worked for him to prevent them from investigating his other crimes. He's like corrupt on top of corrupt. And yet, Louis Gohmert is more scary as an attorney general because he will actually overturn elections that he just doesn't like.
Well, it's the devil, right? That's the issue of politics.
Well, I mean, so what we're left with is there's going to be a runoff in that race with George P. Bush. And George P. Bush is, I think, feckless is the best way to describe him. He's basically, he just launched his campaign using with a koozie that basically insulted his entire family, but touted his Trump endorsement. Right. So you've got a guy who's just kind of a lickspittle for Trump, but otherwise, not really raising a lot of red flags, versus a guy who's an actual corrupt criminal. And both of them are preferable to the guy who ran explicitly on a pledge to overturn elections that he doesn't like. And this is the state of play in Texas. And unfortunately, it's not just Texas. Texas gives a really great example of it, but it's local and state elections across the country.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're seeing it in California, newly drawn 7th Assembly District, okay, in California. There is a man, his name is James Eric Perrine. He sat in the Sacramento Republican County Party. He was sitting in their council. Then there was a story that broke last year that he had ties to the Proud Boys Sacramento chapter. So he was kicked out of the Republican Party of Sacramento. He is now running for that assembly seat in the 7th District of California. And this is not, as you're saying, like, these are not anomalies to have these extreme people that have ties to extremist organizations or have extreme platforms. This is not an anomaly. They are actually like a microcosm of a larger issue that we're seeing happening in American electoral politics.
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing a huge rise of American radicalism, as we like to talk about here at Renew America. We're tracking it all across the country in federal elections and state and local elections. And the crossover, the tie between the anti-democracy movement and then the militia or militarist movement is particularly terrifying. So, it's something we continue to watch. It's something we have to be conscious of and fight back against. It's why it's so incredibly important that we, all of us as voters, look deeply into the people who are running in our state and local elections. It doesn't matter if it's dog catcher or governor. Make sure it's somebody who is worthy of that position. And then on top of that, we need to find more of those renewers, people who are going to run on an explicit campaign of pro-democracy, pro-liberty, people who will take the job seriously and will do that job with dignity and with respect for our rights. So with that, I think we're coming up on time, Mariana. I want to thank you for joining me on the Friday Flannel panel. We're heading into the weekend. Any positive thoughts for our audience before we sign off for the week?
I mean, renew America. Isn't that a positive thought? If you guys haven't checked out our YouTube channel, please do and get super excited. I know I'm excited, but I'm always excited. I think I'm like the team cheerleader of the group. But next week, I sit down with John Grinspin to talk about his latest book, Age of Acrimony, How Americans Fought to basically preserve their democracy. And it's going to be an incredible chat. I'm so excited. If you haven't checked out his book, I definitely recommend it. And please tune in for our RAM chat next Wednesday, 2 p.m. Eastern. I'll be sitting down with him and I cannot wait.
All right. Well, we're excited for that too. Marianne's going to nerd out quite a bit with the Smithsonian's political
curator. Yeah, I can't. I
so.
can't even. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. It's going to be a good time.
It'll be a good time, and of course, we'll be back in a future Friday. Joel Searby might be joining us, hopefully, and not that Mariana didn't do a fantastic job with us on this flannel panel Friday, but remember, if it's Friday, put on your flannel and join us for a chat. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye guys.